Let's see if we can wrap up the history of the OCA this evening. We are proposing to summarize the history of the OCA, these last two classes. A huge undertaking. The history of the OCA is really very dramatic, very full of adventure, full of high drama, lots of wonderful people, figures, saints, but we won't have time to deal with each one of them or to go into detail too much. We're just going to do a general, a broad sweep to give you a sense of who the OCA is and to orient you, to where we are in the OCA, and given us a sense of where the OCA stands relative to the rest of the Orthodox world. So let's pick it up again. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, and then we'll do a run through and see if we can get up to the present. So the history of the OCA begins in Alaska with the team of 8 monks, including our own Father Herman, who is a simple monk, not a hiero monk, arriving in Kodiak, Alaska. Okay, come on now, where are you? Where's Kodiak? It's down here somewhere. There's Anchorage, so Kodiak must be over here someplace. I'm not seeing it real quick, but anyway, in this general area, Kodiak, Alaska, traveling from St. Petersburg way over there to in the year 1793-94 by the directive of the Russian Empress Catherine and Metropolitan Gabriel of the Valam Monastery near St. Petersburg, on the border, near the border of Finland. Their purpose was to serve the spiritual needs of the Russian Orthodox citizens there. This included the Eskimo wives that Russian trappers and traders had married, and the children born of their union, called Creole. I don't know the history well enough to answer my own question, which is, did these Russian monk missionaries intend initially also to evangelize the natives, or was it their initial intention simply to minister to the Russian trappers and traders and their families? Whatever was their intention at the beginning, evangelizing the natives, becoming their defenders and their advocates against the brutal treatment and injustice they suffered at the hands of the Russian owners of the trapping and trading companies, is what they began to do almost immediately, as soon as they arrived. In fact, I was looking at the map here, and I noticed that there's a Baranov Island right here. Baranov Island. Well, Baranov was one of the bad guys. He was one of the owners who was brutal in his treatment of the natives. The Russian missionaries started schools. They learned and they became fluent in the different Alaskan dialects. They translated the prayers and the liturgical services of the church into the native dialects. They had orphanages. They taught the natives carpentry. St. Innocent, for example, taught the natives. St. Innocent in the early 19th century, he was contemporary with St. Herman. After teaching the natives carpentry skills, he used them to help him build the cathedral in Sitka, Alaska. And I was looking for Sitka, and I don't know if it's on this map. It's down here somewhere. If I had more time, I'd study it and see if I could find it. In short, the missionaries became so much a part of the native culture that the Eskimos came to treat them as family. Saints such as St. Herman and St. Innocent endeared themselves to the Alaskan peoples, and the personal charisma, the holiness of these saints, together with the natural alignment of the Orthodox faith with the principles of the Alaskans' own native spirituality, made baptism into the Orthodox faith the most natural thing for the natives to do. Their Orthodox faith, far from destroying their native spirituality, actually enriched it and revealed its perfection in the Christ of the Orthodox Church. The history of the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, begins here in Alaska because Alaska, though a Russian colony, became an American territory in 1867. And because the Russian Orthodox that evangelized the native Alaskans is what became, I should say the Russian Orthodox Church that evangelized the native Alaskans is what became in 1970 the Orthodox Church in America. So we are studying our ancestor, the OCA's ancestors. Actually, we're studying the OCA. This was when a synod of bishops in Moscow granted autocephaly to what had been the Russian Orthodox mission to North America. Now, the original cathedra, the bishop's chair in Alaska, was in Kodiak, which we have not found yet. It's somewhere around in here. I want to say around in here. It was transferred, it was originally in Kodiak. And then it was moved somewhere over here to Sitka. And then from here down to San Francisco in 1874. It was Archbishop John Mitropolsky who was the archbishop at the time. And when the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church moved the cathedral to San Francisco, this was at the urging of the North American bishops themselves, who believed the Alaskan parishes could be served more effectively from San Francisco than from Sitka because of extenuating circumstances. Then it was at that time that Archbishop John welcomed the move from San Francisco, welcomed the move to San Francisco, because he saw it facilitating his own evangelical goal of bringing the Orthodox faith to the lower 48. But for purposes of telling the history of the OCA, the move from Sitka to San Francisco provides opportunity to highlight significant differences in how the Orthodox faith has been brought to North America, the lower 48, in contrast to how it was brought to Alaska. I believe these differences may be significant for understanding why the history of Orthodoxy in America looks like it does, and why we find the Orthodox in North America, why we find in the Orthodox in North America a mission that, in spite of the evangelical outlook of such people as Archbishop John Mitropolsky, whom I just mentioned, or of a Nicholas Bering, B-J-E-R-R-I-N-G-A. He was a convert from Roman Catholicism. He was ordained in Moscow and appointed to serve a showcase parish in New York City. This is in the last half of the 19th century. That's easy to remember because he became Orthodox out of protest of the doctrine of papal infallibility that was promulgated, what was it, 1870s or something like that. So in spite of these, of men such as these, who were largely, they were intellectuals, they were students of religion, they were not peasants. In spite of these, the Orthodox in North America came to be actually an effort to protect the Orthodox faithful's ethnic heritage and not to evangelize their American neighbors. So you can see in the history of the late 19th century, now we're after the sale of Alaska to America in 1867, you can see among the few Orthodox that are scattered throughout the country, very few at this point, you can see a very clear divide between what you might call the intellectuals and the rank and file. Although at this time, actually, that division can't be drawn too sharply because even the rank and file, at this point, we're talking 1860s, 1870s, early 1880s, they were mostly professionals or, working for their various state departments, perhaps, living in America. This divide at this time perhaps cannot be drawn too sharply. But nonetheless, it can be argued that, the fact is that measures to evangelize the North American faithful, or North American people, ran side by side with the many ways that the Orthodox faithful, the rank and file as it were, sought to protect their ethnic heritage from American culture, with the creation, for example, of brotherhoods and associations and parishes. The lower 48 America we'll call it, was already a Christian nation. I'm pointing out now some of the differences that obtained between the Alaskan mission and the Orthodox entrance into the lower 48. The lower 48 was already a quote-unquote Christian nation. It was largely Protestant Christian, unlike Alaska, which of course was not Christian, unless you were talking about the Russians who had settled there, and then they would have been Russian Orthodox. Missions in America would not require evangelism so much, but so much as proclamation and or apologetics, demonstrating the heresies and the errors of the non-Orthodox. This is something that Archbishop John in San Francisco in the 1870s, this is what he loved to do. He was an intellectual. He had graduated from the best theological schools in Russia. John Mitropolsky, and he loved to write. He was an intellectual, and he liked to write articles and to argue with the Protestants around him, to point out the errors of Protestantism. But he was not. His tribe was not very large. But I wonder myself, since Protestant Christianity at this time, at least on the level of the rank and file in the pews, would have been much more, because it was much more biblically based than Protestant Christianity is now. I mean, honestly, would a Lutheran in 1880 even recognize the Lutheran Church today? And that goes for just about any Protestant. The Nazarenes that my wife and I came from, we weren't even around it yet. The Nazarenes wouldn't start until 1906, and they started, as a evangelical movement, seeking the pietistic, as kind of a pietistic, camp meeting style spirituality. The holiness movement is what they were a part of. So the holiness movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this would be a snapshot of kind of a character, of America at this time. Already very biblically based. Whether or not you agree with the biblical interpretation at this point is beside the point. The point is that they're biblically based. They go to the Bible, they read the Bible, they study the Bible. Their emphasis is on a relationship with Christ, being saved, a person confessing Christ. They believe, for example, still that they still believed in the Holy Trinity. They believed in the virgin birth. They believed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, born of the Virgin and becoming Son of Man. So I'm wondering if, because of this, there was among the Orthodox, especially the rank and file, the ones who were not theologians, the ones who had not trained in Orthodox seminaries back in Russia, I'm wondering if there wasn't among them the sense that America did not need to be evangelized. And actually you see evidence of that in the sources. Many things about the history of this time tell me that there was a regard for the Christianity of the Protestants by the Orthodox, so that there wasn't such a felt need to save them. They were already baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, for example. They were already preaching and confessing Jesus as the Son of God, born of the Virgin, and incarnate as Son of Man. The religious foil of the Orthodox historically, remember, those of you who have studied the history of the Church, the religious foil of the Orthodox was Rome, not the Protestants. Not Augsburg or Canterbury. And there had been back in the 1600s or so, maybe 1700s, so very close to the time that St. Herman is coming to Alaska with his other missionaries, there had been, between the Lutherans in Augsburg and the Patriarch of Constantinople, a rather lively correspondence that took place over several years. The Lutherans in particular were thinking that perhaps the Orthodox would find them to be, okay. that obviously they did not agree with Rome, but also in an effort to justify themselves, the Lutherans sought the support and the support of the Orthodox, thinking that perhaps there could be a communion between the Orthodox and the Protestants in their mutual distrust and dislike of Rome. So this was going on. I can't remember the exact years now, but this was very close to this time when America is being, when the Orthodox are coming into America in the last half of the 1800s. Those communications between Augsburg and the Patriarch of Constantinople, they broke down when it became clear that for one thing, there was the distances to contend with in the communication, the back and forth, and letters back and forth aren't the same as personal face-to-face communication. But even beyond that, it became clear that Protestant theology is not compatible on many principal points with Orthodoxy. But even so, Protestant was new, and it was relatively unfamiliar to the Orthodox. Not only that, but they also had the German Protestant influence on their own Peter the Great, who was the Emperor of Russia in the early 1700s. And in fact, Peter the Great adopted many German Lutheran practices and ideas and brought them into the Orthodox Church. For example, the choirs that sing in the balcony, that was from Peter the Great on the model, as I understand it, on the model of the Lutheran churches in Germany. Protestant for the Protestants for the Orthodox were relatively an unknown. They were unfamiliar with them. As I said, the foil chiefly was Rome, not the Protestants. So from 1794, when St Herman arrived with his 7 brother missionaries in Kodiak, from 1794 to 1880, while many dramatic and compelling stories of Orthodoxy in Alaska were being written, the stories in the lower 48 were few and far between. Orthodox parishes can be found in this period. We're now looking at the, let's say, 1867, let's say from the time that the see of the Alaska Mission is transferred down to San Francisco. So let's say between 1874 to the last half of the 1880s. So this is not a long period of time. Just a little over, just within the period of 15 years or so. In this period, only a few major cities can be found with Orthodox parishes in them. For example, and these parishes would generally be on the coasts or in the industrial centers of the United States. For example, Seattle. When was that founded? I think that parish was founded in the 1870s. Portland. Which parish did you go to?
St. John Baptist.
Okay, yeah. So do you remember when that was founded?
30 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. But there was a parish in Portland. Again, founded roughly around this time, 1870s, early 1880s. There was a parish, of course, in San Francisco. There was one in Galveston, Texas. I believe there was one in Chicago. I believe Trinity Cathedral was built in the 1880s or so. It was served for a time by Father John Kucherov, who in the early 20th century, when the Bolsheviks took over in 1917, he was the first Russian priest to be martyred by the Bolsheviks. He had gone back to Russia by this time. So Chicago, New Orleans, that parish was a Greek parish that was founded in 1864, and New York. And that was pretty much the extent of the Orthodox in the United States at this time.
When did they start moving to Pennsylvania?
Okay, we're coming to that. The Orthodox who attended these parishes were professionals and their families. For example, many of them worked at the consul or for the embassy. So they were intelligent, they were educated. These parishes were multi-ethnic because there were Orthodox from many different ethnic backgrounds who were congregating together. They were multi-ethnic. And therefore, because English was the language common to all of the different ethnic groups, the services would be served in English. maybe also in Greek or Slavonic or whatever, but certainly English, because that's what everyone knew. If the service was, when seeking a priest, however, to serve the parish, these professionals may have started from their own resources. They would as often consult their nation's consul in New York, for example, as they would as soon do that as they would consult the Russian Orthodox Archbishop in San Francisco. You understand that according to the canons of the Church, the Orthodox Church worldwide, a territory is under the episcopal oversight of the Church, the Orthodox Church, that is first established there. And so, since the Russian Orthodox Church was first established in Alaska and then in the United States, the Archbishop of North America, the Russian Orthodox Archbishop of North America, his seat in San Francisco, he was the one that had jurisdiction over all the Orthodox in the United States, except for the Greeks. They're a different story. The Greeks they wanted to see the view, the Greeks coming into America at this time, not that there was a whole lot yet. They wanted to classify them as the diaspora, the dispersed. The Orthodox were dispersed. And according to the canons, it's the Greek patriarch who has jurisdiction over the diaspora. Now, I don't think that this would be the beginning of that tension between Moscow and Constantinople that has become what it is today. But it certainly was a chapter in this political power play between Moscow and Constantinople. Let's see. There are for certain many details behind my extremely broad historical assertions that will show how colorful the stories are that I'm not telling. But I don't know these details, and I can only guess or speculate on what the issues may have been that a short history hasn't time to tell. For example, is it possible that the fact that the lower 48 did not include Alaska, when Alaska was being missionized by the Russian Orthodox Church, was that the justification for Constantinople viewing the Orthodox in the lower 48, and in particular any Greek emigrants, as diaspora? Do you understand what I'm saying? The Greeks came to America before 1867. And at that time, the Russian Orthodox was still in Alaska, which is still a Russian territory. So I don't know. It's a question that I have. Would this be a justification would it be an argument of the Greek patriarch for claiming that the Greeks who were in America at this time were part of the diaspora, so that they do not fall under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Archbishop of North America? I don't know. Be that as it may, from 1874 to 1880, say 6 years, from the time that the see is transferred to San Francisco to 1880, from the time that the Russian Missionary Cathedral was moved to San Francisco to the time that mass immigrations of Orthodox peoples began. Or even, going back before 1874, let's go back to 1867, when Alaska was sold to the United States. Regardless, whichever date you choose, the fact is that Orthodoxy in America at this time is in its infancy. There was only, as I said, there's only a smattering of Orthodox Christians throughout the United States. It is easy to guess that with the canonical archbishop having begun to reside in San Francisco only a few short years ago, maybe 1874, remember, there was no website, there was no internet. There was no World Wide Web at this time. There were some newspapers, but even they had to travel. They had to travel by train or, I don't know, horseback to get, I don't know. But communication was slow. With Orthodox parishes only beginning to be established, with only a small number of immigrants in only a few U.S. cities, the issue of serving the Orthodox in the lower 48 was not yet mature enough to become much of an issue yet. One wonders to what degree the different Orthodox communities even knew of the others. I would guess Portland and Seattle knew of each other, but did they know of New Orleans? Did they know of Chicago? Did they even know that there was an Orthodox bishop in San Francisco, who canonically was their bishop? In the 1880s, this situation changes dramatically with the hundreds of thousands of immigrants from virtually all the Orthodox mother countries beginning to flood the United States over the next several decades. As we said last week, many of these were young and single males whose objective simply was to earn enough money in America and then return home to enjoy a good life. Since they did not intend to stay, many acquired only a rudimentary knowledge of English and American ways. Even when they sent home for a wife and extended their stay indefinitely, they continued to live on the fringes of a society that tolerated their presence only because they were a source of cheap labor. From New York City, the usual port of entry at this time, and now we're in the 1880s, 1890s, let's say, maybe the early 1900s, the immigrants would disperse to the industrial centers of the Northeast, seeking out relatives or compatriots who could help them find work. They met in rooming houses, saloons, and coffee houses to evangelize, to discuss evangelical strategies? No, to discuss the latest news from home. They formed social clubs and patriotic organizations in order to establish a coherent strategy for going out and evangelizing the lower 48? No. It was to maintain a sense of cultural identity. They organized mutual aid societies and brotherhoods, philopticals, FOCA, or what's it called now, the FROC, Federated Russian Orthodox Club, for support in times of distress and need. The new immigrants were not necessarily deeply religious people. I'm quoting from John Erickson. And I'm wondering if by that it's a nice way of saying that they weren't religious at all. They were worldly people. But in their home countries, religion was a part of life. Without the church, there was no Greek or Serbian or Romanian or Russian life. I mean, think about it. These people are coming over, these immigrants are coming over, not to evangelize America. They're not coming over at the directive of the church. They're coming over for purely economic reasons. Creation of parishes typically proceeded without formal approval or material support from church authorities. Members of a community would raise money to buy land and construct a church building, or more often, to purchase an existing building. Only then would they think of asking a bishop, usually one from their home region across the sea, to send them a priest. In this way, immigrant groups established hundreds of parishes in which they were free to express their pride in their social, cultural, linguistic, and spiritual heritage. But almost inevitably, these parishes tended to become closed ethnic ghettos or enclaves, with little interest in wider Orthodox unity and little sense of mission, if any. They were more interested in preserving church life as they had known it in their villages in the Old World. This is another point of contrast between the situation in the lower 48 and the situation in Alaska. With little knowledge of Orthodox canon law, remember, these are not theologians, they're businessmen, they're peasants looking for work and willing to work for cheap labor, for little pay, so they can go home eventually. So they're not theologians, they're not canonists, they're not priests, they're not bishops. They're just simple peasant folk looking to survive, looking for a good job to survive. So with little knowledge of Orthodox canon law, but with a great awareness of how most American Protestants organize their church life. And remember, again, the Protestants are not the religious foil, historically, of the Orthodox Church. It's Rome. So they're not trained, if you will, or whatever word you want to use, to look askance at the Protestants. They're just Western Christians who, like us, don't particularly like Rome. But they had a great awareness then of how most American Protestants organized their church life. And so the immigrants also learned from their Protestant neighbors to emphasize the independence of the local parish. Control, typically, of a parish was in the hands of a board of trustees. And this was, moreover, would have been modeled after the unions, that is to say, after the unions were founded. And this board, in other words, you'd have management on one side, and you have labor on the other. The priests, the hierarchs, the bishops, all those guys, they're management. So their place is on the other side of the iconostas. The laity, they're workers. Their place is over here on this side of the iconostas. And so, just like in the union, there's this conflict. There's always simmering potential for conflict between labor and management. So also in the Orthodox parishes, there grew this tension between the priest and the laity, developing into it could be an ugly anti-clericalism. The board of trustees, as it would have been like the unions, was elected from among the more prominent laymen of the community. The priest was regarded as an employee of the parish corporation, and the board of trustees could dismiss him if he did not meet its expectations. I don't know, for catechumens this may sound strange because you don't understand what's the big deal. But you see, for the Orthodox, the bishop is the guarantee of our orthodoxy. Even now I'm working with a situation in this area. A group of people have come together, and they say that they're coming together under the influence of some priest, some Orthodox priest that is now in Russia, but now he's going to come back to the United States sometime this month. They're petitioning Archbishop Daniel. They want to start a mission community. But you don't just start a mission community because you want to. There's credentials that have to be examined, and so now I'm in the process of examining where these guys are coming from, and who's this priest that put them together. No, this isn't, no, I'm not telling you where it is. But it doesn't really matter because it's been duplicated many times. It just gives a sense, you see. We want to know who this priest bishop is. We want to know where he came from because we want to ensure that he's Orthodox. I mean, there's lots of traveling salesmen out there. So the bishop is the symbol of Orthodox unity, but he's also the guarantee of orthodoxy. He's the guarantee that the sacraments are sacramental and that they are actually full of grace. So this is why it's such a big deal. This situation with how the parishes are starting to come together, and it's kind of like independent Protestant churches. The impact of this chaotic church life, driven by ethnicity. Can you see how it's driven by ethnicity? On the Russian North American Mission's administrative competence, the impact of this chaotic situation, all of these ethnic parishes, starting on their own, and then calling for a priest, maybe calling for a priest from the Orthodox bishop, maybe from their mother country. It's a free-for-all almost. The impact of this chaotic church life on the administrative competence of the Russian Orthodox North American Mission was augmented. It was intensified in the 1890s with the return of the Greek Catholics, the Unia. They were called Greek Catholics by the Romans, and they're called Uniats by the Orthodox. This was a group of Orthodox churches that came under Rome in the 1500s, 1600s, after a series of geopolitical kind of formularies in which they were allowed to maintain their Orthodox ways so long as they swore allegiance to the Pope. But that meant that the priests could marry. They served the Byzantine liturgy, and they kind of kept to themselves. Their own little Greek Byzantine communities, but they were nonetheless under the jurisdiction and the authority of the Roman bishops. So in 1889, a young Uniat Greek Catholic priest came to Minneapolis, to St. Mary's, Father Alexis Toth. So how about that? We live in Minneapolis, which is which is a major chapter in the history of the Orthodox Church in the North America. He was assigned to St. Mary's from Eastern Slovakia. He came here from Eastern Slovakia. As he was required to do, he went to the local Catholic priest, or archbishop. It was Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, whose cathedral is there on the bluff, overlooking the capital. He went to the Archbishop Ireland to present his credentials, as he was required to do. But the politeness quickly became a heated exchange when Archbishop John Ireland, learned that Father Toth was not a Latin priest, he was a Uniat, a Greek Catholic priest. And John Ireland, the Catholic bishops, largely in the United States at this time, they were already prejudiced against the Greek Catholics, as they called them, the Greek Catholics, because they're so different from the Romans. And Archbishop John refused to recognize Father Toth's credentials and refused to give him permission to serve or to build a church for the Uniat community in Minneapolis. And that time that was St. Mary's, what we now know as St. Mary's Cathedral. They were Uniats, they were Greek Catholics. So Father Alexis Toth, petitioned the Orthodox bishop of the Russian Orthodox Missionary Diocese of North America. But he had to look for him. He didn't know that there was an archbishop, an Orthodox bishop. So he asked around and finally found out that there's a bishop, his name was Archbishop Vladimir, in San Francisco. So there was a couple of visits, one by John Maliner. I know Barb and I and Dan, and we know the name Maliner. I served at St. Mary's for 4 years, and many of these names that are in this history, I know those names. Barb knows those names. Dan knows those names. John Maliner went to San Francisco to visit with Archbishop Vladimir, and then Father Toth traveled to San Francisco to visit with Archbishop Vladimir, who received him very graciously. And when Father Toth brought news back to actually he went to San Francisco at the behest, at the urging of the parishioners themselves. When Father Toth described to them his exchange with Bishop John of Ireland, this was not the first time something like this had happened throughout the among the Unia, the Greek Catholics in the United States, and it was the people themselves who said to Father Toth, why don't we just look for an Orthodox bishop and can go home or something like that? Why don't we go home? Why should we always be ruled by these foreign bishops? So on the strength of that, Father Toth went to San Francisco, was received very graciously by Archbishop Vladimir, and the next year, in 1891, Archbishop Vladimir came to St. Mary's in Minneapolis, and there he received almost 400 souls into the Orthodox Church. I believe it was also Archbishop Vladimir. He gave them some icons as a gift, and I'm not sure. Somehow St. Mary's has their iconostas from Russia. I don't know what part the Archbishop of San Francisco played in that. I'm sure he played a central part in it. But in other words, they were graciously received and treated very well. So that led Father Alexis Toth, who was later sainted by the OCA. So now we commemorate him as St. Alexis of Minneapolis and Wilkes-Barre, because he moved to Wilkes-Barre after he was here in Minneapolis. He died in Wilkes-Barre. He's buried at St. Tikhon's in Wilkes-Barre. That led Father Toth then to travel throughout the upper Midwest and the Northeast, Pennsylvania and all that, where so many of these Greek Catholic immigrants had come and settled, to work in the coal mines, the steel mills, and through Father Alexis Toth's work, 65 Greek Catholic communities with over 20,000 parishioners returned to the Orthodox Church. And as I said, the impact of the chaotic kind of free-for-all that church life was in the United States on the administrative competence of the Archbishop in San Francisco was augmented by the influx of these Greek Catholics, the Uniats, so that now in addition of trying to corral all of these cats, all of these Orthodox parishes, and bring them into some kind of administrative unity, they now had all of these unions that they had to take care of and bring and nurse back into the church, make sure that they were taken care of. So what we see in this period then is a Russian North American mission confronted by many challenges quite different from the Alaskan mission. But nonetheless, we do see the Russian mission addressing these challenges creatively and vigorously. Remember that Orthodoxy is still is in its infancy now. I mean, it's only since, 1874, 1867. We're now in the early 1900s, a space of 25 years? So they're just, the Orthodox, this is the difficulty that confronts the archbishops, the bishops, the priests of the Russian Orthodox North American mission is compounded by the influx of all these immigrants. I mean, it's enough to go into a country and try to evangelize the people who are there. But then what if you have an influx of hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming in to complicate things? So, and we're just looking at 25, 30 years or so. So, when you look at the historical setting, and you are drawn to the fact that it's kind of a chaotic free-for-all, but you have to look past that. You have to take the historical situation into context. And when you do, you begin to see how creatively and vigorously, as I said, the Russian mission was addressing the challenge of missions in North America, even though its primary focus, if not almost its exclusive focus, almost, not quite, was on the Orthodox. It was not on the American Protestants and Catholics. It was exclusively almost exclusively on the Orthodox themselves. However, to facilitate the Orthodox entrance into American society, the Russian Orthodox mission in North America undertook to translate many of the prayers and the services of the Orthodox Church into English. There are a number of different publications, newspapers, journals that were not for the intellectual elite. They were for the Orthodox faithful, so they would be distributed to the faithful throughout the parishes. But they would be, they might be in Russian, in fact many of them were, but they'd also be in English, because not everybody spoke Russian, so it would be in English because that's what everybody spoke. And it may have been these English translations, I don't know, this is a question I have. I haven't read the history long enough or studied it deeply enough to be able to answer the question myself. But I'm guessing that it was these English translations addressed to their own people, their own Orthodox people, that together with the educational and the apologetical, polemical articles that appeared in the various publications, this is what may have facilitated the conversion of many Americans to the Orthodox Church in this period, because there were converts in this period. I mentioned Father Nicholas Bering as a leading example, a Roman Catholic bishop who was disgusted with the doctrine of papal infallibility when it was promulgated. So he became Orthodox. He went to Russia. He was ordained in Russia as a priest, and he was sent by the Russian Synod to New York City to start a showcase parish. And that parish was visited, to showcase the Orthodox worship. And that parish was visited by luminaries, in New York City. Some leading intellectual government person had some kind of a salon where the intellectuals would gather and have these, like a philosopher society, but it would be these discussions that they would have about, and they would talk about religion and theology, and Father Nicholas was right in there with them. So he's one example, or leading example of conversions that did take place during this period, which I find fascinating because, as I'm saying, it's quite clear that even though it is not true to say that there was no evangelizing by the Russian Orthodox mission to North America at this time, nonetheless, the fact is that 90% of its work was simply to administer to the needs of the Orthodox who were there in America. To facilitate the need, to administer the Orthodox in America with all of these different ethnic jurisdictions coming together, and congregating in their different ghettos, creating their own parishes. Bishops were consecrated by the Archbishop of North America with the blessing, of course, of the Synod in Moscow. I'm not clear on if whether or not those bishops would have to go to Moscow or if they had to go to their mother country to be consecrated. That's a question I haven't answered for myself. But nonetheless, bishops were consecrated in America to facilitate the administration of the Orthodox Church in America. So an Albanian bishop was consecrated to serve the Albanian parishes. A Serbian native was consecrated as bishop to serve the Serbians, and so forth and so on. And see, there was an Antiochian or Syrian bishop consecrated to serve the Syrian churches or the Antiochian immigrants. So this presents to us what many today would take as a model for what an Orthodox Church in America should look like, where you have one ruling bishop with other bishops, but each ethnic group being served in its own ethnic traditions, small t, where the ethnic traditions are not canceled or suppressed. They're allowed to be given their fullest expression. The liturgical practices of each nationality would be preserved and honored, but it all be under one ruling bishop. Because again, the bishop is the symbol of Orthodox unity, and if there are many bishops in a city, it's just absolute craziness. The symbol is shattered, and it's witnessing to what is not actually true, which is that the Orthodox are one faith, one church. We're not fragmented into different theologies or different doctrines like the Protestants are. We are one faith, so there should be one bishop to reflect that. So let's see here. Okay, where am I? I lost my place. On here. Okay. I need to find my place in here. So we see the Russian Church at this time working creatively and energetically in so many different ways to bring this chaotic ethnic situation into a cohesive church life. We see the Russian Church appointing its best and brightest as bishops and priests of the North American mission. Now, a priest by the name of Tikhon Belavin was a mere 33 years old when he was appointed Archbishop of the North American Missionary Diocese. He served as Archbishop in North America for 9 years. Before, he was reassigned to a diocese in Russia. And then in 1917, after he had been serving as a bishop of a Russian diocese for 10 years, he was consecrated. This is in 1917, he's consecrated the first Patriarch of Moscow. Since the Patriarchate of Moscow had been disbanded by Peter the Great almost 200 years earlier. We haven't the time here to do justice to Saint Tikhon, who was canonized by the Russian Church. We commemorate him, if I can remember, at the end of the service as Tikhon, a Patriarch of Moscow, an apostle to North America. We do not have time to do justice to St. Tikhon and all his visionary work while he was the Archbishop of the American Mission, but he's a giant. He's an absolute giant. He articulated an inspiring vision of Orthodoxy in America that is still the benchmark for the OCA. Whenever people feel that we're losing our bearings and we want to regain our bearings, we go back to St. Tikhon. It was St. Tikhon who moved the bishop's see down from San Francisco to New York City. This is in 1905, 2 years before he would be reassigned to Russia. But St. Tikhon was not, as I say, St. Tikhon was not allowed to continue working to build the North American diocese into a unified Orthodox Church. That work would fall to others because St. Tikhon was called back to Russia, eventually to become the Patriarch of Moscow. And then the Russian Revolution hit. In February of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II yielded power to a provisional government of the Bolsheviks. With his abdication, the Russian Orthodox Church convened the All-Russian Council in Moscow in August to pursue, get the timeline here. February 1917, Tsar Nicholas yields power to a provisional government. August 1917, an All-Russian Council is convened in Moscow to pursue the long-delayed plans for internal reform. The communists take power on October 25th. So we got February, August, now on October 25th. On October 31st, the council chooses Archbishop Tikhon as the first patriarch of Moscow since Peter the Great. On that same day, October 31st, the same day that Tikhon is elevated to Patriarch of Moscow, the communists shot Archpriest John Kucherov to death. He was the first martyr of the Bolshevik Revolution. Many expected the revolution, and I should say he was the first of more than 12,000 clergy and 100,000 Orthodox Christians who would be martyred by the new godless rulers of Russia. That's just at this time. Many expected the revolution to be short-lived. It appears that none anticipated its savagery. By the end of the 1930s, the communists had forcibly suppressed all of Russia's monasteries and seminaries. Fewer than 100 churches would remain open in the vast empire of Russia. But they remained open only as a show, in order to give the appearance to foreign visitors that there was freedom of religion in the Soviet Union. And as we all know, under Stalin, the number of the new martyrs of Russia would reach into the millions. The effect of the Bolshevik Revolution on Orthodoxy in America was devastating. I liken it to a hand grenade thrown into a room and just shattering everything into little pieces. The ethnic divisions in the United States that were already strong, but which the infant Russian mission was starting to bring under control, now had nothing to bring them to heel. Financial support from Russia to aid the North American mission in administering all of the Orthodox in America was cut off, so that the North American mission could not fund any missionary initiatives. The North American Archdiocese itself was thrown into monetary chaos. Parishes were mortgaged to address financial challenges. The result was that the process of bringing parishes under episcopal authority was reversed. Parishes again became independent congregations, which again only intensified the priest versus laity antagonism that had prevailed before along the lines of the union's management versus workers. And that tension, I would say, was again intensified and exacerbated, always by the shadow of communism. The question of whether or not this bishop, that priest, is in secret cahoots with the communists, and whether or not that he should be trusted. But what made things worse is that St. Tikhon was placed under house arrest. He was placed under house arrest almost, very soon after he was elevated to the Patriarchate, and that would have been, remember, in 1917. 8 years later he died, 1925, while under house arrest. No doubt he was martyred. He continued, however, to serve as Patriarch, but in name only, so that the communists could use his office to further their godless and destructive agendas, even here in North America. They used Tikhon's office in their effort to gain access to the assets of the churches in the North American mission. In 1922, at the Third All-American Council in Pittsburgh, the North American Archdiocese, with clergy and church members in attendance, proclaimed Archbishop Platon as Metropolitan of all America and Canada. This would pave the way, so in other words, there's a story there, I won't go into it. This would pave the way for the North American mission in 1924. So St. Tikhon is still alive. In 1924, so get that date in your mind, 1924, to break all ties from Moscow. to protect itself from the communist efforts in America to manipulate them and gain access to their assets. The Americans, the North American Orthodox, the Orthodox in North America refused to take a pledge of loyalty to the communists because they could not trust any directive coming from Tikhon. The directives that were coming from Tikhon during this time, they all bore the signs of coercion and stress, and they all would have been detrimental to the well-being of the North American mission. The fourth All-American Council meeting in Detroit in 1924 proclaimed, so this is in Detroit, 1924, it's a useful place and date to remember, proclaimed the North American Archdiocese, and this is, I would say, unprecedented, historically unprecedented in the history of the Church, I think. Proclaimed the North American Archdiocese to be a temporarily self-governing church until a future council of the Russian Orthodox Church could deal with ecclesiastical affairs under conditions of political freedom. From that time onward, the Russian Orthodox mission in North America, which was called the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church, if you ever hear that name, that's referring to the Russian Orthodox mission in the United States. The Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church, but we call it more popularly the Metropolia, would pursue its own troubled course in the Orthodox world from that time on. You'll also recognize this period in the 1920s, when America is on the eve of the Great Depression. Global tensions already produced World War I. That ended in 1918, just after the All-Russian Council in 1917. But geopolitics continued to escalate, of course, as preparation for World War II, which would be from 1939 to 1945. So not only is the Metropolia cut off from Moscow, first by the Bolshevik Revolution, with the arrest of St. Tikhon, and then from the need to make itself independent of Moscow to protect itself from communist influence, but it also now begins to suffer from the depression in America. Now that the Russian Orthodox mission has proclaimed itself independent from Moscow, its canonical status becomes irregular and is thrown into question. The enemies of the Metropolia, the Russian Orthodox Church, begins to call them schismatics. But even so, its competence and authority to govern the ethnic groups of the North American mission are now rendered virtually impossible. It's hard for us, perhaps, to appreciate the gravity of this circumstance. I would dare say that priests, any priest who has been a priest for even a few years, can recognize the face of evil in this situation. It's on a national scale, of course, but the priests see the same dynamics of evil in the parish. When an evil is committed in such a way that the innocent victim is made to look like he's guilty, and then he's blamed. And that oftentimes is the priest who's made to look like he's evil because of something else that was, or he may have done something necessarily to protect the parish from the evil, and then he's accused of all kinds of nasty things. Just from the parish experience, and you would magnify that exponentially to bring it up to the national level, one can begin perhaps to understand and appreciate what Tikhon was going through there under house arrest in Moscow. One perhaps can begin to understand what the priests and the bishops were going through, what the people were going through. It's an evil situation. It's an evil circumstance. Meanwhile, the ethnic groups, in order to find support both canonically and materially, in other words, monetarily, they have, as it were, virtually no choice but to petition their respective mother countries for a bishop and a priest. And so, as a result, you have now these ethnic jurisdictions that are created in the United States, whereas before there would just be an ethnic parish with a priest. Now you have ethnic parishes with their own priest and bishop for almost each ethnic nationality. And this is how the situation came to be what it is here in America, as a result of the Bolshevik, of the Communist Revolution. But even this non-canonical situation, while it certainly mitigates the witness of orthodoxy, I mean, how many on the outside are confused when they see the Orthodox Church? They see the Romanian Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox, the Albanian, the Greeks, the Russian. You know, they wonder, you know, who are you, man? Are you all different churches? And also as a result of that division of jurisdictions, the multiplication of jurisdictions, you have all of these the Greeks, the Russians, the Serbians, the Romanians, they're all working independently of each other. I mean, think what could be done if they would marshal their energies and they would all work as one. Think what could be done in America for Orthodoxy. But even this non-canonical situation, while it certainly mitigates the witness of Orthodoxy, as I've just described it, does not destroy it. This is something to consider, to reflect upon. It does not destroy it. Communism could not destroy the church, even when it sought to destroy the churches and to martyr her priests, bishops, and faithful to the tune of millions. The church's witness has been mitigated in the eyes of the world, but surely the discerning eye can see past the facade and see that behind the geopolitical nonsense, the faith is as powerful as ever, producing new confessors and martyrs, even as the spirit of Antichrist seeks to destroy the church, even here in America. In America today, the Orthodox churches continue to attract seekers and inquirers. Why? Well, you can answer that question. Because of the integrity of the doctrine and because of the beauty of the worship, no doubt, in spite of the plurality of ethnic jurisdictions that give the appearance of disunity. But the ethnic churches, theologically, sacramentally, are not disunited. In other words, beneath the surface of the ethnic, of the jurisdictional dioceses, whatever the different jurisdictions, it's one faith. And this is, as we said last week, this is what distinguishes the Orthodox churches in the jurisdictions from the Protestants. We have all of these different jurisdictions, but what distinguishes them is not the doctrine, or the faith, or the sacraments. It's simply the ethnic heritage. That's it. You can also look to Soviet Union, and you can reflect on how the communists, the atheistic, the godless communists sought to destroy the church, sought to actively to destroy the church. What happened? They failed. Even the church came back stronger than ever. And of course, there are still efforts, there's still the geopolitical efforts going on to destroy the church and destroy her witness. Meanwhile, you look at America. You have all of these Protestant churches. Nobody's persecuting them. Nobody's seeking to destroy them. And yet you see all of these Protestant evangelical churches splintering right and left. I don't know how many of them there are now. Something to think about. Because again, what holds the Orthodox Church together are the sacraments and the faith. You can go to any Orthodox church, whether Romanian, Serbian, Greek, Russian, whatever, you're receiving the body and blood of Christ at that altar. It can be a good choir, it can be a bad choir, but they're singing the same prayers. And the chance of you becoming a saint is just as great as it ever was. This is the situation that prevails in America until the 1960s, the situation that I'm describing. the metropolia sought a number of different ways to regularize their canonical status, even to the point of going to the Patriarch of Constantinople and petitioning to be taken under him. But his response was, "You're Russian. Only Moscow can help you. Go to Moscow." Of course, they couldn't go to Moscow because of the Cold War and the tensions between the churches, what's I want to say, being used by the communists to execute the communist agenda in the United States. So of course, that was not really an option. However, in the 1960s, the tensions between Moscow and Washington began to thaw. And in this period, starting about 1963, a group of clergy of the Metropolia, led by the likes of Father John Meyendorf, Father Alexander Schmemann, Father John Narabecki, Father John Skvier, Father Dan Hubiak, and guess what? Me, Dan, and Barb know every one of those guys. They're close personal friends of ours. That's kind of cool to me. They're starting negotiations with bishops in Moscow, and with a particular bishop, what was his name? I can't remember his name, darn it. And initially, these conversations with Moscow have as their aim how to regularize the canonical status of the Metropolia, how to regularize the status, so that the canonical status of the Metropolia would no longer be a question. But the sources are at least what I'm reading, and I'm getting this actually from Father Alexander Garklovs, who Barb, Dan, and I also know. He's also a close personal friend of ours. He was a chancellor of the OCA some years ago. I'm getting this from him, that it was, and he's telling me in his article that he wrote for the diocesan website a couple of years ago for the Jubilee of the OCA. He's saying that the sources that he has access to don't really explain why this happened or exactly how it happened. But somehow in the course of these conversations between the Metropolia's delegation and the certain bishops and let's say the delegation from Moscow, it's like it came from out of the blue. Oh, well, why should we just stop at regularizing the canonical status of the Metropolia? Maybe it would go better if we just gave you autocephaly. And so, in a relatively close to the end of this whole process, suddenly the agenda shifts from regularizing the canonical status of the Metropolia to granting the tomos of autocephaly to the Metropolia. And that's what happened in 1970. A delegation from the Metropolia would travel to Moscow in a synod of bishops in Moscow on March 31st, 1970, signed the tomos of autocephaly. Father Schmemann wanted to make sure that you sign it before midnight on March 31st. Can you guess why? So it's not signed on April Fool's Day.
Oh. First is also St. Innocent's.
What's that?
St. Innocent is commemorated on March 31.
That's interesting. That would be another reason. So anyway, the tomos was signed on March 31st, 1970. And we perhaps cannot appreciate or understand the joy that prevailed amongst in the Metropolia when that was signed. Sad to say, it was not the solution to all the problems in the United States, but autocephaly, by the way, means independent. That's to say, we have our own head. We govern ourselves. We elect our own bishops. We don't have to go to the mother country to have our bishops elected. We run our own affairs. We are our own jurisdiction. We have our own metropolitan. Out of the 14 autocephalous churches, 4 or 5 of them recognize the autocephaly. The others either ignored it or they actively denounced it. But the fact remains that the OCA now is among the churches of the Orthodox world. And even Metropolitan, our Metropolitan, starting with Metropolitan Theodosius, up to even now Metropolitan Tikhon, the relationship with the Patriarch of Constantinople has been slowly improving over the years. And it's even in spite of that, the controversy, if you will, of the OCA's canonical status and the legitimate, the justification of a local Moscow synod of bishops granting autocephaly. That's what Patriarch of Constantinople will claim is the irregularity here. He will claim that he alone has the power to grant autocephaly. But of course Moscow disputes that. So here we come. And in fact, Father Garklaus toys with the idea, because he asked the question also in this article. He asked the question, out of all of the solutions that were at hand, why autocephaly? Why going all the way to autocephaly? There are other measures that could be taken just short of that. For example, we could have been granted autonomy, which would mean that we could still run our own affairs, but they would have to be under the blessing of the mother country. So we'd be autonomous, but we'd not be our own church. Why autocephaly? And he can't find an answer for that. Because again, all the sources that I don't know what he means when he says that the sources don't show it. He might mean that that many of the sources are still buried in archives somewhere and have not yet been explored. I don't know. But the answer is not, and even Schmemann in his personal memoirs is rather vague on that point, as though there's some things that aren't ready to be displayed yet. But he suggests, Father Garklaus suggests, on the strength of another book that he wrote, which is written only in Russian, that perhaps at least a factor in the granting of autocephaly to the OCA was that it was another way of Moscow giving it to Constantinople. Whatever, the fact remains that the OCA is now an Orthodox church, And I told you the story, my wife and me, why we became Orthodox, When we discovered that there was an OCA, I was overjoyed. This was in New York City, and I learned that I didn't have to become Greek or Russian to become Orthodox. I was already in love with Orthodoxy. I was already convinced that this was the true faith. There was no question in my mind. And I would have become Orthodox one way or the other. When I discovered that there was an OCA, there was nothing keeping us out of the Orthodox Church. So when I learned that there was an OCA, I remember it very distinctly. I was talking with one of my Greek Orthodox fellow graduate students, and I think I was also talking with the Yugoslavian Orthodox student. They were both telling me, yes, there's an OCA. I said, you're kidding me. So I remember I went home, and the next day or two, I opened up the Yellow Pages. Jason, do you even know what Yellow Pages are?
I know what the Yellow Pages are. I'm technically illiterate. I'm not book illiterate.
Okay. And I go to Orthodox churches in our area, and I find Orthodox churches, and I'm going down the names of the priests. Narabeki, Skavir, Kacinda, Kuharski, Edwards. I'll bet he's a convert. A name like that, he's got to be a convert. So for sure he was. So we went to our first service at Saddlebrook, at 12 Apostles in Saddlebrook. That was an experience. We'll tell you the story sometime if ever you're interested. The long and short of it is we went on Memorial Day weekend. We were going to the Wyckoff Church of the Nazarene at the time. I had already preached a number of times. I was this hotshot seminary student from Kansas City, Nazarene Seminary in Kansas City. I had my future in the Nazarene church all mapped out. I knew where I was going, but I fell in love with Orthodoxy, and so did my wife. So on Memorial Day weekend, we went to Saddlebrook, 12 Apostles, and that Christmas we were received into the Orthodox Church. And I left everything. My wife and I left everything. Left our family. I left a certain career. So you see, the cradle Orthodox do not understand the converts. They can't. How can they? Our own children don't understand us because they grew up in the church. The cradle do not know the soul searching that the convert has to go through. They don't know the family dynamics that they have to confront in leaving the church of their family. And ours was a very strong religious church family. You truly, in a real way, you have to sell everything in order to become Orthodox. And so the cradle it does kind of frost me, I confess. It does frost me a bit when they accuse the converts of being hyper or super Orthodox. Excuse me, Mr. Nosh. I'm proud to be Chuji. I like being Chuji. I don't want to be worldly like the Nosh are. I'm being mean now. I don't want to be, it's like the Nosh. Nosh means us. Chuji means them. Means a foreigner. And this is real big. This is real big in some churches. Either you're Nosh or Chuji. And if you're Chuji, you would never really fully assimilate into the life of the church because they are so ethnic. But anyway, that's another story. I shouldn't get into that. I also wanted to share the story of our priest. That's actually why I started to say that we went to Saddlebrook, New Jersey under Father Thomas Edwards, because yes, he was a convert, and he described his conversion to us. He grew up as Greek Catholic, Uniat, and he was at Uniat Seminary, and went to an Orthodox church, and he was so taken by the beauty of the worship. He described it as his own St. Vladimir's experience. That it was so beautiful he didn't know if he was in heaven or on earth. Like the commissaries from like the ambassadors from St. Vladimir testified. And that was the beginning of his entrance into the Orthodox Church. He married a woman, cradle Orthodox, who, when her parents found out that he was going to become a priest, wept. Not out of joy, because they knew what the priest life was like in the ethnic parishes in those days. It was awful. So we have many heroes in those Orthodox priests in this period that we're talking about, from the 1880s until even up to the 1990s. And even still today, there's still a few isolated parishes that still have that metropolia mentality, us versus the priest. This is our parish, it's not yours. We don't trust you. You just leave us alone. You do your part on that side of the iconostas. Let us do our part, and we'll be fine. There were lots of heroes, lots of hidden saints, in those priests. So anyway, this is a very, very fast climb up the mountain to get us to where we are today, and you only have a vague sense, I'm sure, even yet, of where we are today. This history of the OCA, as I'm saying, is very, very rich, very compelling, full of lots of heroes, full of drama, adventure. It is actually it is fascinating. It's a fascinating study. And I gave you, if you have a chance to get just one book, I would recommend this book, Orthodox America, 1794 to 1976.
Is it still in publication?
Is it?
I'm asking you.
I have this book from years ago. I think it is. I don't know for sure. If you can find it, this is the book. Because it has many primary sources, it has pictures. So you can get to see some of these great men, St. Innocent, St. Tikhon, parishes. St. Mary's Minneapolis is in there with Father Alexis Toth. And, it's a thick book. So if you can read through this, you'll have a pretty good handle on the history of the OCA and of Orthodoxy in America. So why don't we stand, we'll say a prayer, and then you'll be free to go. Truly it is me to bless you, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond comparison than the seraphim. Without corruption dost thou give birth to God the Word, true Theotokos, we magnify thee. Christ is in our midst. All right, well, that's it for this year.